What's going on, guys? Welcome to the channel. My name is Rowan, and today I'm bringing you a very short video with a few tips on how you can improve your portrait photography, precisely film portrait photography. So a quick heads up, I have thought of these based on film photography, but these will actually apply to either digital or any other genre of photography in general. So my first tip on how you can actually improve your portrait photography is something I call training your eye. What I mean by this is you should practice visually inspiring your eye to see more photography or more high standards of photography. So basically, if you can curate a list of photographers that really inspire you, or their work really just evokes a certain emotion out of you, list those photographers out and curate them in the way so that you can actually, from time to time, when you feel you need some visual inspiration, go to their websites, look at their work, go to their Instagram pages, look at their work, and then just consume their artworks. Because I honestly feel once you learn, or once you see more and more beautiful work, once you see more work that inspires you, more work that is just well executed, you'll slowly pick up things, you will slowly notice things that you could add to your own workflow, to your own style of photography. Don't go now and start copying exactly what somebody else is doing. There's a difference between being visually inspired by somebody and just plain right copying what they do. Don't copy what somebody else is doing, but find a group of photographers, a list of photographers whose work really inspires you, and make sure to visit their websites quite often, interact with them on their Instagram, consume as much of, basically what I'm saying is consume as much work that inspires you visually, and gradually over time you'll start to make improvements, because your brain, your eye is just now used to seeing all this, is used to seeing a certain standard and level of work, if that makes sense. Tip number 2 is something I call unusual light. What I mean by unusual light is we're all taught that you should shoot, we're all under the assumption that when you begin photography that you should shoot at the most ideal lighting times. So basically your golden hours, your sunset, your sunrises, which are beautiful. They produce some of the most fantastic and gorgeously colored images, but something I always found to be intriguing, or something that I've learned over time that it just makes images pops, is something I call unusual light. Unusual light is, I mean, things where or scenes where you look at a scene and maybe the light is seeping through sort of like a shaded texture, and it's creating a scattered pattern on either a wall or on either, and you place your subject in there and it'll just have speckles of lights on their face or on their skin, and it doesn't have to be natural light. You can recreate some of this by maybe putting some sort of textured material between yourself and a light source, or between the model and your subject, between your subject and maybe the sun, and it creates a very dramatic looking shadow. That's what I mean by unusual light. So if you are scouting and walking around, for instance, looking for places to shoot, don't only look for very aesthetically pleasing backgrounds or pleasing things to shoot around. Keep an eye out for unusual light. I normally find that you'll find a lot of it in, say, if you're shooting in a place with a lot of trees and the sun will seep through the tree leaves and will create a scattered pattern, or if you're shooting in maybe an urban area and the sun is at a lower angle, you'll see that if it goes through a fence, or it goes through a building window, or it goes through some sort of texture that will let light through and block some of it, will always create a pattern of scattered light and shadows, if that also makes sense. Tip number 3 is foreground. By foreground, I mean whenever you're shooting something, and you can have a very simple background and you can have a very complicated background, but once you start adding foreground element into your composition, basically by foreground element is, I mean, putting something in between yourself and the subject. So you'll have yourself and you have the model, and then you put something in between, or you shoot between something, and that will always give you a sense of depth, or a sense of that'll always give you a sense of depth, which is always aesthetically pleasing. And I find most of the time, like sometimes I'll look for things to shoot through, or I'll actually even create things to shoot through just by finding things around me. A prime example is maybe if you take if you're shooting sort of like in a forest or somewhere where there's plants or something, pick up a branch with some leaves and just hold it up to your camera and just put it slightly in front of the lens and shoot through that. You'll always find that little bit of depth, that little bit of foreground play out of focus, especially at wider apertures, will give your photo just more sense of depth, and it'll just create a more 3D texture feel to it, which gives I think brings the photo more to life than if it was just a simple photo, even if it's a very well executed photo. I always find just to add something interesting to your photos, you always think that foreground elements help. Don't overdo it though. Don't start shooting everything to have foreground elements. I just feel that sometimes you'll shoot a photo and just it lacks something. It just lacks a little bit of depth, a little bit of punch to it. Foreground elements always are just a nice creative way to just compose your shots, and foreground elements are something that you should really actually look into. Tip number 4 is nothing to do with the camera itself or shooting itself, is communication. I always find that for you to get the best out of your subject or your model, communication is one of the most important things throughout the whole process. Make sure that you as a photographer, you come across with a very clear idea of what you expect from your model, a very clear idea of what you hope to achieve at the end of the shoot, or a very clear idea of exactly how you expect their photos to look, so that your model actually has a very clear idea, and there's no miscommunication. And I find it's very, very overlooked amongst the photography community, but communication, your model, communicating very well with your model, and making sure that your model understands exactly what it is you are hoping to get from your session, or you're hoping to get from your final results, and always plays a big key. So if you are organizing a shoot with a model, always try and create some sort of like a mood board, either on Pinterest or something like that. Create a mood board, a feel, maybe a few example images from maybe a previous portfolio you have, or something that inspires you from somebody else's work. I just feel that communication is something that is overlooked a lot, and it is vitally important for you to be able to relay exactly what you need from your shoot onto your subject. It's something that a lot of people don't mention a lot, and a lot of people don't speak of that often, but communication with your subject is one of the most important things throughout the session that I've learned, that if you work on your communication, if you learn how to clearly lay out your ideas and lay out your visions, you'll drastically improve your photos. Tip number 4 is using a long lens. Basically what I mean by using a long lens is precisely anything longer than 50 mil. So 50 millimeters and longer on, I'm talking full frame equivalent. So 50 mil and longer, 50 mil, 85, 135, 200. If you don't have a 50 mil prime lens, which is, I always suggest, is the first thing that you should precisely look into if you're getting into portraits. But if you even have something like a cheap 70 to 300 zoom or 70 to 200 zoom lens, try and use that for your portraits, because longer focal lengths actually are very flattering on subjects, on your models and the people that you photograph. It's just, it does, because longer focal lengths have more compression than distortion, so they always bring everything in, and it is much easier to get that out of focus background that everybody kind of finds pleasing. So try and use a long focal length when you're starting out, or when you are wanting to get into portrait, and then over time then you can gradually start playing with wider lenses. And I'm not saying that you can't use wider lenses for portraits, I'm just saying that with wider lenses you need to be very intentionally using it to portray something very wide, because you know the distortion that a wide angle lens will bring always is something that you should use to your advantage. So if you are just starting out and you're trying to take all these nice pleasing portraits, I'd always suggest starting out with anything that is 50 mil or longer. Tip number 5 is props. Don't be afraid to use all sorts of props in your photographs. Sometimes a photograph can look very, very simple, or a shoot can look very, very simple, and then the addition of just one small little prop always helps. The few examples that I have of very nice props are sort of like old film cameras, which is something I've spoken about in the past. Is old film cameras, old film video cameras, wine glasses, crystal glass bottles, sunglasses, something that will just add a bit of pizzazz to your photos, something that will just draw the attention of the viewer even more. Don't overcomplicate it and don't overdo it and start adding too many props in one go. I always feel one or two props always builds a nice set. For me personally, I don't like adding so much, so I always tend to use one or two props, and it should always complement the styling of your shoot. So if you're going a vintage looking sort of session, it makes no sort of sense for you to incorporate something like a Bluetooth set of earphones or a fancy iPad tablet to your shoot. That just does not make sense. So if you are using a prop in your shoot, make sure that it kind of fits aesthetically with the styling of your shoot in general. So I tend to lean always on sort of like a retro aesthetic to my shoot. So I find my film cameras come in handy as prop. Things like glass jars with fruit, vintage hats, sunglasses, things like that. Always, I feel, just add a bit of extra pizzazz to your photos. So don't be afraid to use props in your photos. Plenty of time I've seen people shoot so much beautiful work, but sometimes you just feel that this photo just lacks a little bit of a wow factor, something that will just grab the viewer's attention even more, something that will just complete the whole photo. So don't be afraid to use props. And last but not least, don't be afraid to experiment. As I say, grab inspiration from other people, visually take in content that other people are creating, visually be inspired by the millions of photographers that we've got these days. Don't be afraid to experiment. Don't be afraid to create your own rules. Don't be afraid to go out there, be inspired by somebody, but then add your own touch to it. Creatively go crazy. Just add things to your photos that will make your photos yours, that will make your photos look like they belong to you. Like when somebody looks at your photo, they will instantly know that that's a so-and-so photo. So don't be afraid to go out and create photographs that resemble how you creatively think, how you creatively express yourself. Photography is an art form of expressing yourself visually, and don't be afraid to add your own stamp to your photos. All these rules that I've been giving, all these tips that I've given you, and all the millions of tips that are out there on the internet and that other people will give you are just a mere guideline of what should get you into the door, what should get you onto the right path. But do not let that be a boundary of what you should and what you shouldn't do. Make sure that you always add your own stamp and create your own style. And to end all of this off, I've always had words to live by in photography, and that is interesting subjects make interesting photos. If you always remember that, you are kind of set, you are kind of in the right direction. Always remember, interesting subjects make interesting photos. Always remember that. That is pretty much the basic formula for photography. If you get that formula correct, you are on the right path. And finally, I'd just like to thank all you guys for all the support that you've given me, especially over the last 2 videos that I've put out. A lot of you guys have reached out to me on Instagram, and I really appreciate all the support. I will be making tons more videos. I have a lot of things planned and a lot of videos that I've already scripted out that I'll take time to film, edit, and put out as soon as I can. In the meantime, if you've enjoyed this video, give me a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel if you're new and want to see more of my work, and I will see you guys in the next one. Cheers.